Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 96, The Battle of Magnesia. We have now arrived at Magnesia, the successor to Raphia in terms of a battle noteworthy enough to merit its own episode. And, I suppose, a successor to Ipsus, but that's besides the point. Let's watch as fate weighs up her scales and decides whether Antiochus III will come out the victor or the loser. Just a note before we begin, Wikipedia dates the battle as either December 190 or January 189 BCE, compared to my previous confident assertion of 190 BCE, based on the chronology notes in my edition of Livy's Rome and the Mediterranean, part of his History of Rome. Note that Cassius Dio, in Book 19 of his Roman history, also places the battle in 190 BCE, at least according to the chronology in the footnotes of my edition. My copy of the Chronicle of the Roman Republic also seems to indicate 190 BCE for the battle, so I'm going to go with the majority and say that's the year Magnesia took place in. Anyway, with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, on with the episode. Now, the Romans were about 20,000 strong going into the battle. There were 2 Roman legions, and 2 legions of foreign auxiliaries, each with about 5,400 men in them. In the middle of the Roman deployment were the Romans themselves, with the Latins being on the left and the right flanks. At this junction, Livy goes into some detail to describe the Roman military formation. In the front of the line were a group called the Hastati. These were the younger and less experienced soldiers who carried spears, or hastae, hence the name. Behind them were the Principes. These were heavily armoured and well-protected men, who were slightly more experienced. At the very back of the formation were the Triarii. These were the most well-experienced soldiers of all. Usually, there were 1,200 Hastati, 1,200 Principes, and 600 Triarii in a Roman Republican-era legion. Groups of men were arranged in squares, and these were arranged in a sort of checkerboard pattern down the battlefield. Anyway, Eumenes II and his men were stationed on the right, along with Achaean troops, totaling about 3,000 soldiers in total. Consul Scipio, remember him by the way, placed his and Eumenes' cavalry further right again, with about 800 Pergamon cavalry and about 2,200 Roman horse. Finally, right at the end, there were about 1,000 Cretan and Trallian forces. As you might be able to tell, the Roman right flank was well fortified. However, the left wasn't as well protected by the auxiliaries. This is because they were protected by the river, given how the Romans were set up. So, on the Roman left flank and the Seleucid right flank, you have a river running through the battlefield. The banks of this river were steep, and so they insulated the left flank from harm. Still, the consul put a few cavalry on the left. Around 2,000 Macedonian and Thracian soldiers were also left behind to defend the camp. Finally, the Romans also had 16 elephants with them, although I'm not sure where they got these from. At a guess, I would say they originated from the treaty at the end of the Second Punic War a few years before, but it's not a question I've looked into, I will admit. The elephants were put behind the last row of the army, meaning they were supporting the experienced Triarii. They were not deployed at the front because Antiochus III had more than enough elephants to outgun them, 54 in fact compared to the Romans' 16. Not only this, but the Roman elephants were African elephants, whereas the Seleucids had Indian elephants. Livy goes out of his way to tell us that Indian elephants are better, either because they're bigger or because they are better fighters. Now, Indian elephants are up to 6.4 meters long and weigh up to 5.4 metric tons, while African elephants are listed as being 7.5 meters and 6.3 metric tons at maximum. So, they are the bigger species of the two, and this would therefore contradict Livy's statement about Indian elephants being the larger species. The Indian elephant is categorically stated to be smaller in a different source as well, so I'm not sure where that error of his resulted from. Either way, The Seleucid Indian elephants were said to be better, and both species were at the battle. Now, this does call to my mind a statement I made in episode 77 that the Battle of Raphia was the only battle where African and Indian elephants fought in history. Clearly, this deployment would contradict that. However, it may be the case that, if they never actually fought each other, the technicality is preserved, and as we'll see, Livy and my other sources don't seem to mention elephant-on-elephant fighting actually happening. So, this is the overall picture of the Roman deployment that Livy gives us. He then moves on to the Seleucid deployment. In the middle of his line, Antiochus III had 10,000 infantry deployed in the Macedonian phalanx formation. These phalanxes were split into 10 sections, with the gap between each section having 2 elephants in it. These phalanxes, 32 men deep and with huge elephants lumbering in between them, were a sight to behold according to our historian. The Seleucid elephants had their height added to with towers on top of them, each carrying 4 soldiers and a driver. On his right flank, Antiochus deployed 1,500 Galatians and 3,000 armoured cataphract cavalry. There were also 1,000 more lightly armoured Median cavalry with 16 elephants further out. Further right again, the Royal Guardsmen and the Dahae horse archers were also situated, followed by 3,000 Cretan and Trallian light infantry and 2,500 archers. Finally, on the very right, there were a mixture of 4,000 slingers and archers. Moving over to the left flank, so facing the Roman right flank, there were 1,500 Galatian and 2,000 Cappadocian infantry next to the king's phalanxes. These Cappadocians were reinforcements from Ariarathes, whom we mentioned Antiochus III sending out a request for reinforcements to last episode. Clearly, that request paid off. Then, again on the left flank, there were some mixed infantry, light and heavy cavalry, and in front of them chariots with scythes, as well as camels and dromedaries with Arabian archers with swords almost 2 meters long. We then get another mix of infantry from different nationalities, at least 9,000 in number, you get the point. And again, the left flank was provisioned with 16 war elephants. In terms of who was in command where, the king stationed himself on the right flank, with Crown Prince Seleucus in the left, with the king's paternal nephew Antipater. I'm going to pause at this point to say I'm not actually sure who this nephew is exactly. It's very specifically stated he is the son of the king's brother, but no father's name is actually given. If anyone knows, feel free to drop me a line. Anyway, 3 generals, including the man in charge of the elephants, were placed in the middle. Now we have the deployments of both sides. There's nothing left to do but get on with the fighting. On the morning of the battlefield was beset by mist and drizzle. The ground was sodden, which was apparently not that bad for the Romans, but definitely a problem for the Seleucids. Antiochus's line was more spread out than that of the Romans, and the low visibility meant the flanks were obscured from the view of the centre. Added to that, the Roman heavy infantry were not bothered by the rain, whereas the Seleucid slingers and archers found their equipment sodden and unable to be used. I seem to remember rain being a crucial deciding factor in a future English battle as well. I forget if it's Agincourt or Crécy, where the English longbowmen hid their bowstrings under their helmets to ensure they didn't get rained on during the night, while their French opponents did not. If I can actually find a reference for this story I'm referring to, I'll put it in the description, but for now I haven't been able to track it down yet. Anyway, the battle started. Eumenes II of Pergamon played an important part in the fighting. He noticed the Seleucid scythe chariots in the front lines, which he knew could cause chaos among their enemies. However, he was aware that, if the horses could be spooked, such weapons could be turned to create havoc among their own side. So he ordered various archers, javelin throwers and slingers, as well as some cavalrymen, to move out in a loose scattered formation and pelt the horses with projectiles. This had the desired effect, and the chariots veered off in all directions, with the Seleucid camel forces also being spooked. The troops Eumenes had sent out were nimble enough to dodge the chariots, but the end result was the chariots were forced out of the no-man's land between the two armies. So, right off the bat, that's Antiochus' chariots nullified. In fact, they terrified the Seleucid auxiliaries, making them turn tail and run backwards. This left the cataphracts exposed, vulnerable, and without their support staff. This, in turn, left them prey to the attack of the Roman and Allied forces, leaving them either fleeing or swamped by the Allies. At this point, the Seleucid left flank collapsed. This collapse infected the centre of the Seleucid army as well, once the Cappadocian auxiliaries in between the phalanxes and the cataphracts began to panic. Now, this posed a problem. Namely, the phalanxes were armed with long spears, and friendly forces milling about your phalanx is not exactly conducive to this kind of formation, equipment, or fighting. So, the phalanxes were effectively neutralised. Once this happened, the Roman centre surged forwards and threw their spears right into the throng. The Seleucids tried to use elephants to frighten off the Romans, but said Romans, adjusted as they were to elephants after the Punic Wars, just avoided the charges. Not only that, but they also managed to flank or even hamstring the Seleucid elephants. Cut back over to the Seleucid centre, which was steadily disintegrating, with the Seleucid auxiliaries being surrounded and attacked from all sides. However, the story of the battle is not quite over. The Romans looked up from their killing and realised that another section of their line had been pushed back, and Seleucid forces had actually reached the Roman camp. This is because Antiochus III had detected the weakness of the left flank, given their reliance on the river. What forces there were not even protecting said river. So, Antiochus had taken his own cataphracts and auxiliaries forward and surged at the Roman left flank, routing them and pushing them back into their camps while the Romans were shoving at the Seleucid centre. This chase mirrored Antiochus' tactics from 26 years earlier at the Battle of Raphia, with the king recklessly charging forwards without thinking about how this would impact the rest of the Seleucid military. Incidentally, immersed as I've been so far in the Seleucid present, so to speak, I must admit it startled me to look up and realise that Raphia was 26 years ago. How far we've truly come from the anarchic days of Seleucus II and III. Anyway, the man in charge of the Roman camp, a certain Marcus Aemilius, approached the fleeing Roman left flank. He shamed and threatened them into turning round and making a stand. In fact, he killed the men fleeing at the front himself. The routed left flank were, perhaps understandably, more scared of Aemilius than they were of the onrushing Seleucids, so they swung back around and joined Aemilius and his 2,000 men in rushing back towards the Seleucids. Remember, the Romans had left 2,000 Macedonian and Thracian soldiers back at the camp. The Seleucids themselves had become lax in their chase, and now slammed into the reinvigorated Roman left. Eumenes II's younger brother, remember the future Attalus II of Pergamon, also arrived with 200 cavalry, having spotted the chaos on the Roman left. In response to the gathering Roman storm, Antiochus III turned around and fled, presumably followed by his right wing. Livy evocatively tells us that the Roman forces picked their way over the bodies and sacked the Seleucid camps. In the meantime, the cavalry chased down the routed Seleucid stragglers, with Eumenes' forces front and centre. The Battle of Magnesia was over, the Romans had won. Livy tells us that up to 50,000 Seleucid foot soldiers died in the battle, with 3,000 dead cavalry. The Romans also captured 1,400 soldiers and 15 war elephants. According to this same narrative, Roman casualties supposedly amounted to 300 foot soldiers, 24 horsemen, and 25 soldiers from Pergamon. In other words, Livy wants us to believe that almost 200 times as many Seleucids as Romans died. A ridiculous imbalance to be sure, but his hyperbole makes the point. Antiochus III had been utterly humiliated. Cassius Dio gives us essentially the same account of the battle as Livy does, but stays silent on the issue of casualties. What I will say though is that he gives Scipio the honour of sacking the Roman camps. Note that so far I haven't been able to discover which Scipio, but either way the point's rather moot. He also states, rather ominously for our purposes, that Antiochus III fled back into Syria following the battle. Next time, we will see how the world reacts to this humiliation. A word of warning, it will not be the start of a glorious golden age for the Seleucids. Until then, however, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address if you have any questions or comments. And remember that you can ask me a question to be featured in an Ask Me Anything session in honour of episode 100 in a few episodes' time. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.